Hello everyone, this is Shubhankar and welcome to Everything Has a Story, where I share stories with you which the numbers are trying to tell us. And the numbers we'll be looking at today are from the Union Budget of India. You'll find a link to this Power BI report in the description as well as a pinned comment. So when you click on the link, you'll land on this page and here you can click on this button to go into full screen mode. So you can click on this button here and here you'll land on the contents page. Here you can see all the reports I've included in this Power BI report. And you can click on the next page. And this is where the story begins. Here you can see the various sources of revenue for the government of India, right? You can click on each of the category and see what it has been contributing in terms of percentage to government's gross total revenue. And of course, in amounts as well in INR crores, right? You can see GST was only introduced in the year 1718. So going forward, here you can see the ranking for each of the category as a contributor to gross total revenue for the government, right? Here you can click on GST and while pressing the control button, you can click on service tax and excise duties. Here you can see as soon as GST was introduced, the ranking for service tax as well as excise did fell, right? Going back to the previous report, here you can see that if you click on GST, service tax and union excise duties, click here and show as table, you can see right before GST, the amount being contributed by service tax, right, was 2.5 lakh crores, right? And it did fell to 80,000 crores as soon as GST was introduced, right? You can see the changes here. And this is the reason of the fall in ranking for service tax as well as union excise duties. Let's move forward. Here you can see I've combined all the taxes into one category as gross tax revenue. And you can clearly see that gross tax revenue happens to be the biggest source of revenue for the government of India. And this is the reason why during every budget, every year, the rate of taxes are discussed because the government needs to generate a good source of revenue for itself while not burning a hole in our pockets. So you can click on this button here to land on the home page, where you'll find the link to the Union Budgets page. So when you click on the link, you'll land on this page. You can click on Budget at Glance and open the Budget at Glance report. So this is the Budget at Glance report for the year 23-24, introduced in the month of February 2023. Here you can see the Budget at Glance, the revenue sources, right? Here you can see tax revenue net to center. If you go down a bit below, here you can see the breakdown of the same, right? So tax revenue as gross tax revenue, wherein all the taxes happen to be here. And then something called NCCD is transferred to NCCF and NDRF. And then state shares is also transferred from here. And then what we are left with happens to be the net tax revenue, which is then actually included in the government's revenue. So NCCF happens to be National Calamity Contingency Fund and NDRF happens to be National Disaster Response Force. So one more thing we need to understand is that this is the budget for 23-24, but it was introduced in the month of February. And the financial year for the 23-24 will start from March 23, right? So the numbers we can see here happens to be estimates, right? Similarly, last year budget was also estimates, which now have been revised. And the earlier numbers happens to be actuals. So here in this report, you can see that as well. From 2015-16 till 21-22, the numbers happens to be actuals. And this happens to be revised estimates, whereas the present years happens to be budget estimate. So moving forward, here you can see I have broken down the gross tax revenue under direct taxes and indirect taxes. If you click on the next page, we have already discussed this, right? From gross tax revenue, something called NCCD is transferred, right? This happens to be less than 1%. And this is the amount. And then state share is also transferred, right? Which happens to be 30-35% to the states. The taxes collected happens to be from the central government, right? And that is then shared with the state governments as well. And then what we are left with happens to be the net tax revenue. So let's move forward. Here you can see I've excluded borrowings from the revenue, right? And I've taken here the net tax revenue. So here we can clearly see that the major source of revenue for the government, apart from if we exclude like borrowings, happens to be net tax revenue. So moving forward, here we can see the breakdown for the non-tax revenue. And one of the major portion for it happens to be dividends and profits. So for the same, we'll be looking at LIC's DRHP, right? And here you can see that pre-IPO, right? Pre-IPO, 100% of the shares, which happens to be 6 billion shares, was held by the President of India through the Ministry of Finance. So let's look at what has happened post-IPO. We are using Money Control. You can use any other website as well, right? Here we are going to look at shareholdings. And here you can see the top holdings, right? Which happens to be the President of India, 96.5%, right? So going a bit up, we can look at the dividends as well, right? 3 rupees and 1.5 rupees, which means that there were 6 billion shares, right? 97% happens to be 6 billion, which means 18 billion rupees was received by government as dividends. We can also look at Coal India Limited, right? We can click on its shareholdings and here you'll find that President of India is holding 63% via the Ministry of Coal. We can also look at its dividend, here dividend, and look at the historical dividends as well. So here for Coal India, we can see that this is the historical dividends, right? So all these things actually contribute to government's dividends and profits. So going forward, So now I've included the borrowings as well, right? So here you can see only for the year 2021, right? You can see the borrowings were greater than the net tax revenue. Moving forward, okay, for this we have to revisit the budget at glance. So this is the budget and glance. Here you can see something called fiscal deficit, right? Which the calculation happens to be 9 minus 156. So 9 happens to be total expenses. 1 happens to be revenue receipts, which includes tax revenue, which happens to be net to center or net tax revenue, and non-tax revenue. The 4 happens to be capital receipts, but wherein we are not including borrowings, right? Only 5 and 6, recovery of loans and other receipts. And here you will notice that borrowings and fiscal deficits are equal. So this is what this chart is trying to show us. The borrowings and the fiscal deficits have always been the same. Here you will also notice that the borrowings as a percentage to total revenue excluding borrowings, right? Only for the year 2021, right? Government took more borrowing than its revenue. So let's click on the next page. So here you can see how fiscal deficit is being financed, or basically what are the borrowings of government. And the major sources happens to be market borrowings and securities against small savings. And these two contribute together roughly 95% to government's borrowings. So for the same, we'll be visiting Reserve RBI Retail Directs website. So here you can see government securities happens to be tradable instruments issued by the central government or state government. The short-term securities happens to be treasury bills, right, which happens to be less than 1 year old. And the others, long-term, happens to be government bonds or dated securities with maturity of more than 1 year. So you can use the Retail Direct website to actually invest into these tradable instruments, right? So let's say on state government, here you can see all the bonds, right? And the maturity as well. You can click on T-bills or treasury bills, and here you can see for 91 days, 364 days, on 182 days. These happen to be for less than 1 year, right? So I did recently invest into one of the T-bills just to understand how it actually works. Please note that nothing being said in this video happens to be any kind of investment advice. This is only and only for educational purpose. So although you can invest into treasury bill directly, but I do personally use liquid funds more often than retail direct. So here you can click on any of these. We will be looking at ICICI Prudential Liquid Fund, right? You can click on portfolio, and here you can see T-bills, right? 20.45%, government backed 20.45%, right? And here you can see treasury bills. Similarly, for Parag Parikh Liquid Fund, you can see under portfolio, like the treasury bills happens to be 80% of the Parag Parikh's liquid fund. If you go back to the website and click on annual financial statement, click on this report here. Under capital account receipts, here you'll see 14 days, 91 days, 182 days, 364 days treasury bills, right? This is the amount being received from these bills. And similarly, the amount being received from small savings schemes. So now looking at the small savings scheme, these are the various small savings schemes. So recently for this budget, the government actually increased the interest rate for the senior citizen savings scheme to 8.2%. So we have covered market borrowings as well as securities against small savings schemes. So let's move forward. So here we will be looking at government's total expenses. And here we can clearly see that revenue expenses happen to be the major portion for government's total expenses, right? But recently for the new budget, we can see there is a 37.44% rise from the previous year's amount allocated for capital expenses. So when you click on capital expenditure, here you can see how the percentage of expenses has increased, right? And the amount as well, which is a good sign. Moving forward, you can see the breakdown of those expenses, right? We have to go back and visit the budget at glance again. So this is the budget at glance. If you scroll down a bit, here you'll find all the expense categories, right? Major expense categories. You can see pension, defense, fertilizer subsidy, food subsidy, petroleum subsidy. And in this report, you will be able to see the ranking of those expenses, right? How much amount is being spent into the same. And here we'll see that interest has always been the major expense for the government. The main reason behind it happens to be the borrowings of the government. So here you can see defense has almost always been the second highest expense category for the government. But recently what happened was food subsidy here, right? Food subsidy became the second highest expense during the year 2021. Again, it was because of COVID. Okay, one thing I forgot to mention during the fiscal deficit financing or the borrowings, right? External debt did rise significantly during 2021, and this was only because of COVID. So here we can see how food subsidy did rise. But what I found to be most interesting was this, right? Transport. Transport as an expense for the government has risen over the years, and which is again a very good sign. So moving forward, here you can see all the expense categories as a percentage to the total expenses. So here we can clearly see that 20-25% of government expenses happens to be only in forms of interest. And when you click on food subsidy, you can see, right, suddenly from 4% all the way to 15.4% for the year 2021. And when looking at transport, here you can see how from 4.88% all the way to 11.48%. So moving forward, here we'll be looking at those expense categories in terms of amount. Interest, pension, right? You can click on each of the category and see how much government has been spending under each category. One thing to note is that PM Kisan was introduced recently, right? But before that, agriculture and allied activities was a major expense category. And this is the expenses being incurred by the government to promote agriculture. Moving forward, what I've done here is I've included a filter. So you can use this filter, right? And let's say you can include anything. You can include rural development, right? And you can see rural development here. right? Click on that and see what is the percentage of expense being incurred for the same and the amounts as well. You can also click on, let's say, education and healthcare and compare this over the years. So let's move forward. Okay, for this, we have to visit the website. So on the website, you can click on expenditure profile and click on expenditure full profile. So this is the expenditure profile of Government of India. And here you will find the breakdown of expenses in terms of ministries and departments. And this is what this report is going to be talking about, right? So here we are looking at interest payments, and then we did see that the defense expenses always happen to be one of the top expenses for the government. So here we are looking at defense services as a revenue expense, right? And then defense pensions as well. So both of these, when combined together, happens to be defense expenses. So we also did look at the transport expenses, right? For this thing, we'll be clicking on the Ministry of Railways and Ministry of Food Transport. You can see both of these happen to fall under the transport expense category. And here you can see how well they have risen over the years. So you can use this filter as well here, right? You can click here and click 10 plus enter, and you can see all the top 10 expense categories for the Government of India. But what the one problem with is, let's say Ministry of Road Transport, right? When you click on this, you'll see there's a gap here for 1920 and 2021. Similarly, for Ministry of Railways, you can only see the data for the years 2021 all the way to 23-24, right? This is because prior to 2021, the rank of this expense category was below 10, right? So use this filter very, very carefully. Let's move forward. Here you can see all of these expense categories as a percentage as well as in crores, right? You can click on any of these. You can go here, type anything, and here you can, let's say, select Ministry of Defense, and you will be able to look at its numbers in both in terms of rupee crores and in percentage as well. Let's move forward. Okay. So coming back to the document here, you can see that for, let's say, atomic energy, here you can see both expenses in terms of revenue, right, as well as capital. So what I've done here is that in this report, you can see expenses in terms of both revenue as well as capital, right? So let's see Ministry of Railways as well as Ministry of Road Transport. So the revenue expenses, right? In terms of revenue expenses, the ranking of Ministry of Road Transport happens to be 31. Whereas if we click on capital, here you can see, right? It happens to be the number one expense in terms of capital expenses for the Government of India. And the second happens to be the Ministry of Railways. So let's click on the next page. Here you will see that I've divided those expenses in revenue and capital, but here the amount is being shown, right? So let's click on Ministry of Railways as well as Ministry of Road Transport. You can see the capital expenses, but when you click on revenue expenses, you can see this changes, right? You can use this accordingly. So moving forward, what I've done here is that you can select any of the departments and ministries, right? Click on the same, and here you'll be able to see what happens to be the breakdown for them in terms of capital expenses as well as revenue expenses, right? So let's look at railway, right? So here you can see the major expense being incurred in terms of Ministry of Railway happens to be of capital nature. Similarly, let's look at road ministry here, right? Here you can see the revenue expenses have been falling as a percentage and the capital expenses have been increasing. So moving forward, okay, for this we have to visit the website again. You have to go down a bit here, select any ministry. Let's say we did select Ministry of Defense and click on any of the reports. Let's say Defense Services Revenues. So here you can see the breakdown for the same, right? You can see Army expenses, Navy expenses, and Air Force expenses. So this is what this chart helps you to understand, right? So here you can clearly see that Army expenses happens to be the biggest category of expenses under the Ministry of Defense, General Services or Revenue expenses. Similarly, for the Department of Higher Education, right? Here you can see IITs happens to be like 20-21% of Department of Higher Education's expenses. And similarly, what you will find is that for Ministry of External Affairs, right? The aid given to other countries, here you can filter it out, right? And here you can see what is the aid being provided to various countries. Let's look at Bhutan, right? So here we can see the aid has reduced over the years. Whereas when we look at Nepal, you can see. So this will also give you an insight into what are India's relations with these countries. So let's click on the next page. On the website, you can click on receipt budgets, receipts, annexures, go down, and here you'll find revenue impact. Revenue impact under individual and HCF taxpayer. Here you'll see all the nature of incentives, right? So I've taken this screenshot from the income tax website, right? And let's say you fall under the category below 60, right? Under the old tax regime, you are earning more than 10 lakhs. Let's say your income happens to be 12 lakh and you are claiming a reduction of, let's say, 1,50,000. So you're able to save 45,000 as your tax savings. But this very same tax saving happens to be a revenue impact for the government. Because you're able to claim this tax savings, government is receiving 45,000 less in terms of taxes. And this is what this document here discloses. And in this report here, you can see what is the ranking, what is the impact, right, of these deductions to government's income. And the first one happens to be ATC, right? You can leave your cursor here and you will be able to read about which section represents what kind of deduction. So let's move forward. you'll find the amount here, right? You can see under 80C, government is losing 88,000 crores, right, for the year 2021. So let's look at the deductions being provided under the section 80C, right? Here you can see if you invest into these, claim these as a deduction under the section 80C. So if you do look at these investment options, you'll find here that there is PPF, there is Senior Citizen Savings Scheme and National Savings Certificate, right? And all of these happens to be small savings schemes. Here you can see, although that government is including a bit of tax revenue, let's say for the year 2021, it happens to be 88,000 crores, right? We'll go click on the contents page and we'll look at fiscal deficit financing, right? And here you can see, because people are investing into small savings schemes, government is receiving, let's say for the year 2021, it happened to be 5.5 lakh crores, right? It does make sense that government is okay losing a bit of amount in terms of taxes, which happens to be very, very less as compared to the amount being received under the small savings schemes. So let's move forward. Okay, so here what I've done is, let's go back to the gross total revenue, right? Here you can see taxes on income, right? So in this report, we did see that the deductions here shown are for the individuals and HCF taxpayers, and taxes of income happens to cover that category, right? So what I've done is I've taken these amounts and shown the impact of revenue because of the tax incentives provided to individuals and HCF taxpayers in terms of percentage of the taxes on income, right? So because of, let's say, 80C, government did not earn 18.13% of its taxes on income. So if this was not allowed, the taxes on income would actually increase by 18.13% for the year 2021. And here what I've done is I've combined all the categories into one in terms of percentage, right? And here you can see, because of all these deductions, government is roughly losing 30% of its taxes on income for the year 2021. Moving forward, let's go back and look at expenses here. So why is government incurring these expenses under tax administration? This is because to collect these taxes, government needs to create departments, hire people. This is because what I did was I have shown the tax administration expenses as a percentage to gross tax revenue collected, right? So here you can see for the year 2017-18, right, the percentage of tax administration expenses did increase, and the reason behind it happens to be very simple, right? GST, right? Here you can see for the year 2017-18, GST was introduced. Moving forward, I have to look at all of these charts individually. So for the first chart here, you have to look at interest payments, right, as a percentage of borrowings and other liabilities, right? So what does these numbers signify, right? Let's say for the year 16-17. So out of all the borrowings government was taking, 89.75% of it was to pay interest back. In simple terms, it somehow means that you're, let's say, taking a loan of 10,000 rupees to pay back EMI of 8,975 rupees. Not exactly though, but you get the idea. Similarly, what we'll be looking at here now is the total debt, right? This happens to be for each year's borrowings, but this year, interest is being represented as a percentage to total debt, right? Because government has taken a lot of debt before that. So as a percentage, then this percentage reduces significantly, right? So you can see 6.4, 6.46, right? And now it happens to be 6.37. So the percentage of interest payment being made in terms of government's total debt has actually reduced. But what is the main reason behind it? The main reason behind it happens to be that the government did borrow a lot more ever since 2021 and has not repaid it yet. So now to understand the same here, you have to understand that ever since 2021, right, here you can see earlier government only used to take 7.15% of its total debt as new debt. But in the year 2021, government took 15%, double of that, right, as new debt. And this gives you an idea about how government is actually borrowing and paying for the same in terms of interest. And that was the video, guys. If you did learn something new, do like, share and subscribe to the channel. And thank you for watching the video till the end.